They called it the flying coffin, a death trap with wings, too slow to run, too heavy to turn, too fragile to survive. The experts said it was obsolete before it ever left the factory floor. But on one frozen morning in December 1944, a single pilot climbed into that condemned machine, and what happened next would shatter every assumption about what was possible in the sky. Against 30 German fighters, alone, outnumbered, outgunned, he didn't just survive, he won. This is the story of the Brewster Buffalo, the fighter the world dismissed, and the impossible stand that proved them all wrong. Context: the desperate days. The year was 1939, and the storm clouds over Europe were gathering into a hurricane. Britain and France had declared war on Germany after the invasion of Poland. The Soviet Union had carved out its own piece of the spoils, and across the Atlantic, America watched with growing unease as the old world tore itself apart once again. For the smaller nations caught between the great powers, the question wasn't whether war would come to their doorstep. It was when. Finland sat on the edge of the abyss, a nation of fewer than 4 million people, bordered by the Soviet giant that had already shown its appetite for conquest. The Winter War would soon prove that geography and treaties meant nothing when faced with Stalin's ambitions. The Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, sprawled across thousands of islands in the Pacific, rich in oil, rubber, and strategic position. Japan's expansion into China made it clear that neutrality would not last forever. Colonial powers were scrambling to defend territories they could barely reach, let alone protect. And then there were the Americans, still clinging to isolationism, even as the world burned. The US Navy was rebuilding after years of budget cuts and political neglect. Carriers were few, modern fighters were fewer still. In this climate of desperation and denial, nations needed fighters. Fast, cheap, available now. The Brewster Buffalo seemed like an answer. On paper, it looked promising enough. A stubby, barrel-shaped monoplane with retractable landing gear, modern features for the late 1930s. Reasonable speed, decent armament. But the US Navy had already begun having doubts. The aircraft was underpowered. It was gaining weight with every modification. Its maneuverability was adequate at best. Still, orders flowed in, not because the Buffalo was good, but because it was there. Finland bought them. The Dutch ordered dozens. The British placed contracts for their Far East colonies. Even the US Navy, hedging its bets, kept a squadron flying them off carriers. What none of them knew yet was that the Buffalo would become a symbol, not of modern air power, but of desperation. The stage was set. The fighters were being shipped to distant corners of the world, and the men who would fly them had no idea what they were getting into. Design: the compromise fighter. The Brewster F-2A was born from compromise. In 1936, the US Navy issued a requirement for a carrier-based monoplane fighter to replace the aging biplanes that still dominated carrier decks. They wanted speed, climb rate, range, and it had to operate from the cramped, pitching deck of a carrier at sea. Brewster Aeronautical Corporation, a small outfit with limited experience in military contracts, threw their hat into the ring alongside industry giants like Grumman. Their design was unconventional. Where most fighters stretched gracefully from nose to tail, the Buffalo was compact, almost chubby. Its fuselage bulged around the Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engine, a reliable power plant, but one that dictated the aircraft's portly appearance. The cockpit sat high, giving pilots good visibility. The landing gear retracted inward into the fuselage, a modern touch that reduced drag. And the armament, initially just two 50 caliber machine guns, seemed adequate for the threats of the late 1930s. When the prototype first flew in December 1937, it performed acceptably. Not brilliantly, not poorly, just acceptable. The Navy placed a modest order. 54 aircraft, enough to equip a few squadrons while they waited for something better. But then the compromises began to pile up. Export customers wanted more armor, more guns, self-sealing fuel tanks, radio equipment, all of it necessary for modern combat, and all of it added weight. The original Buffalo, light and nimble enough, began to sag under the burden. Performance degraded. The already modest top speed of around 320 miles per hour began to slip. Climb rate suffered. The aircraft became nose-heavy, sluggish in turns. Pilots who flew the early models reported that it handled reasonably well, responsive, stable, forgiving of mistakes. But by the time the export versions rolled out, bloated with armor and equipment, that forgiveness had vanished. One test pilot described it as flying a bathtub with wings. The British, desperate for fighters to defend their colonies in the Far East, received Buffaloes that were so overweight they could barely climb to altitude in the tropical heat of Malaya and Singapore. The Dutch, operating from primitive airstrips in the East Indies, found the Buffalo's landing gear fragile and prone to failure on rough ground. And the Finns, the Finns. They received their Buffaloes before the modifications piled up. Lighter, simpler, closer to the original design. That difference would matter. The Buffalo was not a great fighter. It was never meant to be. It was a stopgap, a placeholder, a compromise born from necessity. But in the hands of the right pilot, under the right circumstances, even a compromise could become something extraordinary. Baptism of Fire, Finland's unlikely shield. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland on November 30th, 1939, the world expected a swift and brutal victory. The Red Army outnumbered the Finns 3-1. Soviet tanks rolled across the border in endless columns. Bombers darkened the skies over Helsinki. Finland had no chance. Or so everyone thought. But the Finns had something the Soviets didn't expect. Desperation sharpened into fury, and pilots who flew like they had nothing left to lose. Among the few modern fighters Finland possessed were the Brewster Buffaloes, delivered just in time for the Winter War. Unlike the overweight export models sent to the British and Dutch, the Finnish Buffaloes were relatively light, stripped of unnecessary equipment, and flown by men who knew every quirk of their machines. Finnish pilots quickly discovered that while the Buffalo couldn't outrun or outturn the best Soviet fighters, it could hold its own through discipline and tactics. And then there was Ilmari Juutilainen. By the time the Continuation War erupted in 1941, Finland's attempt to reclaim territory lost to the Soviets, Juutilainen was already a rising ace. Calm, methodical, lethal. He flew the Buffalo like a surgeon wielding a scalpel. No wasted movement, no unnecessary risks. He understood that the aircraft's limitations demanded patience, positioning, and perfect timing. While Soviet pilots threw themselves into wild dogfights, Juutilainen stalked from altitude. He waited for the perfect moment, dove with controlled aggression, fired a short, precise burst, and climbed away before the enemy could react. Boom and zoom. The same tactic American pilots would later refine in the Pacific. But Juutilainen took it further. He studied the patterns of Soviet formations, learned to predict where they would be, and positioned himself not where the enemy was, but where they would have to go. Over the frozen forests of Karelia, The Buffalo became an instrument of surgical violence in his hands. By 1942, he had racked up dozens of kills. But his greatest moment, the mission that would cement his legend, was still to come. For now, the Buffalo had proven something the world hadn't expected. In the right hands, even a flying coffin could be deadly. The impossible mission, 1 against 30. December 21st, 1944. The sky over Lapland was the color of steel. The war had dragged on for years. Finland, exhausted and bloodied, had signed an armistice with the Soviet Union 2 months earlier. But the price of peace was steep. Finland was now obligated to expel German forces from its northern territory. What had once been an alliance of convenience had turned into a bitter, grinding conflict. German troops, retreating north toward Norway, fought with the desperation of men who knew there was no home left to return to. The Luftwaffe still prowled the skies, striking at Finnish forces with surprising ferocity. On that frozen December morning, Ilmari Juutilainen climbed into his Brewster Buffalo, by now an antique, outclassed by nearly every fighter still flying. The Me-109s and FW-190s of the Luftwaffe were faster, more agile, better armed. But Juutilainen had logged hundreds of hours in the Buffalo. He knew its rhythm, its balance, its soul. The mission was supposed to be routine: patrol the front lines, watch for German bombers, protect Finnish ground forces. What he found instead was a nightmare. 30 German fighters, maybe more, a mixed formation of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, hunting in a massive pack. Standard doctrine was clear: if outnumbered, break off. Return to base. Survive to fight another day. Juutilainen didn't break off. He saw the German formation below him, spread out and confident, assuming the skies belonged to them. And in that moment, he made a decision that defied every rule of aerial combat. He dove, alone. The Germans didn't see him coming. His first pass tore through the formation, 50 caliber tracers ripping into the leader's aircraft. Smoke. Fire. The Messerschmitt rolled, trailing flames, and vanished into the clouds below. Chaos erupted. The German pilots scattered, trying to regroup, searching for the attacker who had come out of nowhere. Juutilainen climbed, gained altitude, and struck again. Another burst. Another kill. The Luftwaffe pilots, veterans of the Eastern Front, were no strangers to combat. But they had never faced anything like this. A single fighter, diving from above with absolute precision, vanishing before they could counterattack, then reappearing moments later from a different angle. Juutilainen flew the Buffalo the way a master swordsman wields a blade. No wasted motion, no hesitation, every strike calculated. For 30 minutes, the fight raged. 30 fighters against one, and one by one, the Germans fell. Juutilainen's guns chattered. His engine roared. The Buffalo twisted and dove and climbed, its airframe groaning under the stress but holding together. By the time the surviving Germans broke off and fled, Juutilainen had downed 6 of them. 6 against 30. In a fighter the world had written off as obsolete. When he landed back at base, his ground crew stared in disbelief. The Buffalo's wings were riddled with bullet holes. Hydraulic fluid leaked from a damaged line, but the engine still purred. Juutilainen climbed out, lit a cigarette, and said simply, "They didn't expect me to stay." The other side of the story: tragedy in the Pacific. While the Buffalo became a legend in Finnish skies, its story elsewhere was written in blood. In December 1941, when Japan struck Pearl Harbor and swept south into Southeast Asia, the Brewster Buffalo became the primary fighter defending British Malaya and Singapore. And, it was slaughtered. The Japanese Zero, light and agile, danced around the overweight, sluggish buffaloes with contemptuous ease. British and Commonwealth pilots, many of them inexperienced, climbed into cockpits, knowing they were outmatched before the first shot was fired. At the Battle of Singapore, Buffalo squadrons were decimated. Entire flights were wiped out in minutes. Pilots described the terror of seeing Zeros on their tails, knowing they couldn't turn fast enough, couldn't climb high enough, couldn't escape. One British pilot wrote in his diary, "The Buffalo is a death sentence. We are lambs sent to slaughter." The Dutch, defending the East Indies, fared little better. Their buffaloes were flown by brave men, but bravery alone couldn't overcome obsolescence. By mid-1942, the Buffalo had been withdrawn from frontline service in the Pacific. The US Navy quietly replaced them with Wildcats, then Hellcats. The aircraft that had once been America's first monoplane carrier fighter became a footnote, remembered mostly for its failures. But here's the truth the history books often miss. The Buffalo didn't fail because it was inherently terrible. It failed because it was asked to do the impossible in the worst conditions against the best enemy fighters of the early war, flown by pilots who lacked the training, tactics, and support to succeed. The Finns succeeded because they flew the Buffalo within its limits. They chose their battles carefully. They fought from altitude, with patience, against an enemy that was numerous, but often poorly coordinated. The British and Dutch failed because they had no choice. They were thrown into desperate defensive battles, outnumbered and outgunned, expected to hold the line against an enemy that had spent years perfecting their tactics over China. The Buffalo's legacy is a lesson in context. A weapon is only as good as the hand that wields it, and the circumstances in which it fights. Juutalainen's legacy, the quiet ace. When the war finally ended, Ilmari Juutalainen walked away with 94 confirmed victories, the highest scoring non-German ace of World War II. He had never been shot down, never bailed out, never even crash-landed. In a war where aces on all sides died in flames or disappeared over enemy territory, Juutalainen survived with a record that remains unmatched. But he didn't seek glory. He gave few interviews. He didn't write memoirs or tour airshows. He returned to civilian life, became a pilot for Finnair, and lived quietly until his death in 1999. When asked about his success, he shrugged and said, "I just did my job, but those who flew with him knew the truth." Juutalainen wasn't just skilled. He was something rarer, a pilot who understood that survival and victory were inseparable. That aggression without discipline was suicide. That the best fighter wasn't the one who took the most risks, but the one who calculated every risk perfectly. And he proved that even in a machine the world had dismissed, genius could thrive. Reflection, the lesson of the Buffalo. The Brewster Buffalo's story is one of contradictions. A fighter mocked as obsolete, yet deadly in the right hands. A flying coffin that produced some of the war's greatest aces. A failure in the Pacific, a legend in the frozen North. What does that tell us? That war is not about perfect machines. It's about context, training, tactics, and the courage to make the most of what you have, even when what you have seems impossibly inadequate. The Buffalo failed when it was asked to be something it wasn't. It succeeded when pilots understood its limits and turned those limits into advantages. Juutalainen's impossible stand wasn't about the aircraft. It was about the man inside it, his patience, his precision, his refusal to panic when the odds turned against him. The world remembers the Spitfire, the Mustang, the Zero, and rightly so. But the buffalo, dismissed, forgotten, ridiculed, deserves to be remembered too. Not as a great fighter, but as proof that greatness is not always about having the best tools. Sometimes it's about being the best with what you've been given. If you want to keep exploring the untold stories of history's most underestimated machines, make sure you subscribe. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a mission. And let us know in the comments which forgotten fighter deserves its story told next. Because every aircraft carries a story, and every story carries a lesson.